Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Though the footage you're seeing here is from my old world campaign that I never got the chance to finish, playing as Belegar against, well, the rodent that Skarsnik is. This was the climax, if you will, of the campaign in quite a lot of ways. Belegar against Skarsnik. Now, what do I want to talk about in this particular video? Well, I want to talk about a particular perspective that I do hear again and again and again from certain parts of the community when it comes to the issue of racial balancing and racial fixes. And this perspective is that, well, not all races should be the same. That's one perspective. But here's my problem with it. While racial variety is very important, and I would never dispute that particular perspective, what I find, quite frankly, asinine is this notion that somehow races with weaker economies, weaker growth, weaker casualty replenishment, or even worse auto-resolve, somehow that adds anything to the game. And I'll be quite as blunt as possible, I find that particular perspective that is shared by a decent number of people to be quite asinine. Well, I apologize if I'm pissing off certain people over here. I understand that certain people want content creators to just tell them what they want to hear and hold their hand and be as nice and gentle with people as possible. I am not that kind of person. I find this perspective to be imbecilic, to say the least. The reason it's imbecilic, and I'm not mincing words on this subject, the reason it's imbecilic is that while racial variety is important, racial variety should not be done in a way where you're screwing over certain races in favor of others. Because that's what really the argument boils down to. When we're talking about growth, when we're talking about things like casualty replenishment, when we're talking about income, or even things like public order or auto-resolve result. That's what really is at stake. There's never a situation in any video game where having a campaign that's inherently worse than another because you're limiting the economy, you're limiting the resources, is somehow great. What that particular situation actually is just basically saying it's having certain races, in this case of Warhammer, Total War Warhammer, having certain races that are flat out worse than others is okay. Well, I find that incredibly stupid and shallow. Like anyone who argues in favor of poor casualty replenishment, poor auto-resolve, poor growth, especially on the basis of some racial variety, is honestly full of shit. Simple as that. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. They are completely parallel to the argument of what a game should be about. And here's the crazy part that many people may not understand. And it's kind of like this idea of like armchair game balancing or whatever, or game development. It's like, one of the things to understand about good races in Total War Warhammer, if we're thinking about, let's consider the powerful races: Wood Elves, Warriors of Chaos, Dark Elves, Chaos Dwarves, Greenskins, Skaven, High Elves. Do any of those races play in the other ways? Like, yeah, there are some mechanics that might be shared between Dark Elves and Chaos Dwarves with the slave mechanic, absolutely, though slaves do work somewhat differently for both of them. But outside of, like, maybe some similarities, these races play wildly different. Oh, it's almost as if racial variety shouldn't be tied to a stupid-ass system of growth, casualty, replenishment, auto-resolve, and instead, racial variety can genuinely exist, and races can play very differently and drastically different, despite the fact that you may have races with great casualty replenishment, great auto-resolve results, in some cases, not all of them, like Warriors of Chaos get great auto-resolve, with Elves less so. High Elves, Dark Elves absolutely can get the Chaos Dwarves. Depends on the kind of units you have, but yeah, absolutely. So, casualty replenishment, yeah, good growth, yes, they can have it, or not even dealing with the growth system, funnily enough, in the case of, like, if we're talking about the Chaos Dwarves, for instance, and to some extent, like, the Dark Elves are so far ahead of the curve on that subject that, yeah. There's also a perspective among certain player bases in general with respect to certain games that slowing someone down and making things annoying is somehow adding depth to the game. No, it's not adding depth, it's just adding annoyances. That's another thing that's an issue I have with certain mods. That's the reason I have an issue with the idea that, oh, we fix sieges by buffing the HP of towers and gates. Yeah, Creative Assembly fix nothing with that. And the argument that a situation like the dwarves, the vanilla dwarves, not modded dwarves, because there are mods that do help them. A situation like the vanilla dwarves with their poor casualty replenishment, poor growth, poor design overall, is somehow acceptable. Yeah, that's an opinion that's just not based in reality. The fact that I keep seeing these kind of comments again and again and again just leads me to believe some people really need to get their heads out of their ass on this subject. And I certainly hope that Creative Assembly is not listening to those people. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't think Creative Assembly should necessarily listen to me. I think Creative Assembly should understand that certain campaigns don't work, and how they improve those campaigns and how they improve those races is something that they should ask and answer. That's why they're game developers. This idea that of armchair game development and balancing being great, no, it's never really great in many ways. In fact, some of the great successes that we've seen from Creative Assembly is when they did decide to innovate on their own and actually did spend time, effort, and energy to do so. The problem that exists with Creative Assembly at the moment isn't the fact that Creative Assembly can't do better. They can, but just they don't necessarily care to. And that's kind of the issue. It's like the effort that they've put in towards balancing is also not that great. I've also heard, like, when it comes to difficulty balancing, Creative Assembly is not even necessarily thinking about the idea of, like, oh, we're making this for normal or we're making this for legendary. They're not making the game for people that play on normal or legendary or anything like that. They're making the game on the basis of tournament players. Yeah, quite literally. I guess that answers the question of why the hell are so many patches containing so many multiplayer changes and very, very few campaign fixes and changes. Well, I guess we have our answers. And it's not like we're talking about like enormous changes like in terms of their impact, but they do exist. And more often than not, we see like things like, oh, unit cost, stat changes on units. Well, okay. Could we have that kind of effort put into, I don't know, racial balancing, economic balancing, growth, casualty replenishment? Oh, but all races having good growth, casualty replenishment is bad somehow. I've never seen a compelling argument as to why that is. Now, that's not to say, when I say good growth, casualty replenishment, I do mean good, I don't mean overpowered. One of the things to mention about, say, the greenskins is that they are just good. They're like out of this fucking world. That's why they're an S tier race. Now, to be sure, racial variety is important, but racial varieties can and should be achieved in other ways, like unique campaign resources that you do utilize. Things like unique campaign systems. Like, as I said, the best races in the game are things like Dark Elves, Greenskins, Warriors of Chaos, Wood Elves, in terms of strength. The ones I think are the most enjoyable to play are Greenskins, Dark Elves, and Chaos Dwarves overall. Like, just really fun races. They play wildly different. They have different systems in a lot of ways. Yes, Dark Elves do use the same instant construction that Chaos Dwarves have. That's kind of where the similarities begin and end between the two of them. Because outside of that, they played quite different. Chaos Dwarves, like Dark Elves, are all about incredible early game aggression. That's why they're an S tier race. Whereas Chaos Dwarves are more about building a massive industrial empire. Greenskins are about a lot of early game aggression. But there's a bit of a difference between that and Dark Elves. Because, like, whereas Dark Elves... whereas if you're playing a Dark Elf campaign, you're taking advantage of the Black Arc ability to really get ahead, lowering the upkeep, recruiting a lot of units for that. In a Greenskin campaign, the dynamic is different. The reason the dynamic is different in a Greenskin campaign is because you have the WA meter, and you're building up towards the WA meter. You activate the WA, you complete a WA. So it ends up actually, like, if anyone tells me that a Greenskin campaign plays similarly to a Dark Elf campaign, I'm like, have you played either of those races, let alone both of them, because the argument that they're similar is nonsense. Then that's even before considering the vast differences in terms of like unit rosters, hero rosters, legendary lords, how those legendary lords do play. This is the thing, variety is not just like, ooh, racial mechanics or a race having good growth or bad growth or anything like that. Variety comes in the legendary lords themselves. One of the problems I have, for instance, with, say, certain campaigns of the High Elves is the fact that, yeah, Wolf 1 is just kind of that powerful on the campaign map that not having access to Wolf 1, looking at you, Emmerich, is something that's going to significantly impact you for a lot of your campaign and make your campaign substantially weaker. That is the kind of thing that I think does need to be improved from a racial variety standpoint, because it is something that affects many races and many campaigns. Like if you're playing a campaign as Dark Elves, you kind of want to make your way back to Naggaroth. If we're playing a campaign as Tomb Kings, yeah, Khemri is the most important area of the campaign map. If we're playing a campaign as the Empire, well, guess what? The Empire does matter. And so essentially the campaigns that are in that situation or close to that terrain are generally going to end up better. Some exceptions do exist, like Volkmar being a big one, though make no mistake, Volkmar will be making his way back to the Empire if you do play him. But by and large, the core racial areas, in most cases, though some exceptions like Skaven and Lizardmen, surprisingly, but in many cases, the core racial areas are the most powerful, and they're worth it so much that playing a campaign in another area just means you're playing a weaker campaign. That's the kind of thing that does matter in terms of racial variety, like how well designed are the campaign areas, how well designed are the races, like do they actually have unique mechanics? And are those unique mechanics implemented in a good fashion? Like, I don't care how unique Nurgle's mechanics, for instance, are, and they are certainly unique, the buildings, the plagues, all that, but they're pretty crap. That's the problem when we're talking about like Nurgle and Kuviav, but denies to certain people, oh, it's like you just don't know how to play them. I've played every race and every legendary lord in this game. I do know how to play them. See, problem is, just because you can play something doesn't mean that something is good. Because you can play something and enjoy something that's freaking terrible, like me enjoying Kislev. Yeah, I do enjoy actually playing Kislev in a lot of ways, even if I do get frustrated at times. But you can enjoy something that's terrible, but that doesn't change the fact that it's terrible. And consider the dwarves. Yeah, the dwarves are a terrible race. They just will achieve less on the campaign map. And this is kind of the final point that I want to get into. The campaign dynamic doesn't change in a campaign, regardless of who you're playing. The early game, in every campaign, in every race, for every part of the campaign, will always matter far more. The difference between a good race and a bad race in terms of power is that a good race, a strong race, achieves significantly more in that crucial early game section than a bad race. And the reason this matters is you can beat the campaign faster and not necessarily easier. That's kind of the thing. It's not necessarily easier, but you can certainly do it faster with significantly less, a significantly lower level of frustration in my experience. That's kind of my problem with the dwarves. Like, I've played many dwarven campaigns in Warhammer 3, for instance. Yeah, this might shock some people, but I actually do play a lot of dwarves. And it always ends up in the same freaking situation. I demolished early game, saves a lot of territory, fight a lot of manual battles, secure a lot of territory, and then I realize that I'm not achieving squat because ultimately my economy is not good enough to support the armies that I need. I'm overextending myself, and I ultimately am just... While you don't necessarily fall behind compared to the AI, you just realize you're falling behind compared to what other factions would deal with. Like, Greenskins having tripled the number of armies and having one armies on top of that. The Dark Elves, same kind of dynamic. High Elves, same kind of idea. Or High Elves being a race, like this is a critical point. High Elves play very different than Dark Elves. Both are pretty strong races. Dark Elves are stronger because they excel in the early game. But kind of an interesting point. High elves versus dark elves situation. While certainly dark elves are far better in the early game, late game, high elves might actually end up being better. And their early game isn't misery to deal with either. Well, unless you're techless, I suppose. But then again, your entire campaign is pretty miserable if you're playing techless. Point being, you can have racial variety if it's done well. Yeah. Dark elves have instant construction. High elves don't have instant construction. Dark elves get heroes at very early on. High elves don't. Maybe they should, because it is limiting their campaign potential. Maybe they should, but like the way their economies are set up, the way their factions work, like slaves versus influence, very different races, but yeah, both of them incredibly powerful. Both of them having great campaigns, depending on the Legendary Lord you pick. You have bad campaigns in both cases, if you pick the wrong Legendary Lord, but you also have great campaigns in both races. Alifanar, Alariel, Tyrion, Marathi, Lokir, even Malekith can be some fun. I say can be quotation marks, because I'm just not fond of Malekith, suffice to say. Mildly different. Chaos Dwarves versus Dwarves, though, that matchup, it's like, why the fuck would you want to play the regular Dwarves versus Chaos Dwarves? The Chaos Dwarves just flat out are better. Because not only do the Chaos Dwarves have many of the same, like, kind of roster of infantry and some of the range units as well as the regular Dwarves, they have better artillery, they have more unit options in a lot of ways, better hero options, better Legendary Lords, and just a better flat-out campaign design. That's where I stand on this. I go back to the original point I made. Anyone who argues that racial variety comes from having races with wildly different growth, like yeah, obviously some difference can make sense, but when it gets to a point where your campaign is genuinely suffering because of it, that's just stupid to argue in favor of that kind of system. Same with vast disparities in terms of income levels, vast disparities in casualty replenishment. Because, like, you end up in this kind of situation if you're playing a dwarf campaign where your playstyle ends up limited because there is a particular playstyle that will reduce your casualty. See, this is the thing about casualty replenishment that some people don't want to realize. Casualty replenishment matters because if you have poor casualty replenishment, big freaking shock, your army variety is actually going to end up limited. That's one of the things that's great about Dark Elves, Greenskins, Chaos Dwarves, Warriors of Caste, and others, is that you can experiment with so many different playstyles. This is the same thing with growth. You can experiment with different buildings, get different things, as opposed to being incredibly limited. That's the value of having a high income level. You can, again, experiment and have a better campaign playstyle. And yeah, variety, the point I'm getting to, variety. That's crucial. You can have greater variety if you have the options. There are some people who believe genuinely in the idea that limiting things is a great thing. I'm the kind of person who believes that A Total War Saga Troy was a far better game than people give it credit for. But the reason Troy was great is because it gave you a ton of resources, at least on the campaign map. The battles of Troy were bad. But Troy was great from one perspective. It gave you a ton of resources so you could play around with them. You had a wide variety of playstyles you could adopt. Some worked, some didn't, but you could experiment. Whereas with something like, say, Shogun 2, I think that's the extreme example in Total War. In Shogun 2, you had the reverse situation where basically, depending on which lord or depending on which campaign you started, you kind of had a very significant limitation on your campaign. You can mod it, sure, but we're talking here vanilla experience. Warhammer 3 works best when you have more choices to make in that campaign, when you have the flexibility of doing so from an economic growth, casualty replenishment perspective. Also recruitment. Let's not even talk about that. Like the fact that dwarves have 2 recruitment slots by default is pretty freaking pathetic compared to what other races can do. Costine, signing out.